It began with a glint of silver buried in the dark, damp earth. On a humid August afternoon in 2008, 9 years after the silence fell, 8-year-old Noah Miller was digging for treasure beneath the sprawling branches of a centennial oak tree. His small hands, caked with mud, closed around something cool and metallic. It wasn't a pirate coin or a lost toy. It was a heart-shaped locket, tarnished by nearly a decade of secrets and soil. The estate in the Hudson Valley, New York, had been quiet for years, a place haunted by a memory the family tried to either forget or sell. But the ground doesn't forget. It holds on to things, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to unearth them. And on that day, the past broke through the surface with the undeniable weight of solid silver. The object felt heavy in Noah's palm, its intricate floral engravings clogged with dirt. He wiped it clean on his jeans, revealing its delicate form. It was a perfect heart, split down the middle by a thin, almost invisible line. He didn't know that his mother, Charlotte, wore its identical twin around her neck every single day, a constant, cold reminder against her skin. To him, it was a beautiful, mysterious find on a boring summer day. He ran back toward the old house, his discovery held out in front of him like a trophy. He was oblivious to the fact that he wasn't just carrying a piece of jewelry. He was carrying the trigger to a story that had been violently paused, a wound that had never truly healed. He was about to hand his mother a ghost. Flashback to June 12, 1999, the same Hudson Valley estate, but vibrant with life. White tents dotted the lawn, champagne glasses clinked, and a string quartet played softly in the background. It was Charlotte Hayes' wedding day. She was marrying David Miller, the man she loved, surrounded by everyone who mattered. The air was filled with optimism, the scent of roses, and the promise of a long, happy future. Her twin sister Amelia stood beside her, a mirror image in a pale blue bridesmaid dress. They were inseparable, two halves of the same whole. They even wore matching silver lockets, a gift from their grandmother. On that perfect day, under a perfect blue sky, the idea that tragedy was lurking just hours away was unthinkable. It was a day for beginnings, not for endings. Amelia Hayes was radiant, but a subtle tension flickered in her eyes, a shadow that no one else seemed to notice. She smiled for the cameras, toasted the happy couple, and danced with their father. Yet, she kept glancing toward the edge of the woods, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of the heart locket at her throat. Later, several guests would vaguely recall seeing her in a hushed, intense conversation with Marcus Thorne, a charismatic family friend whose charming smile never quite reached his eyes. The argument, if that's what it was brief and quickly smoothed over. Amelia returned to the reception, her expression unreadable. She hugged her sister one last time, whispering something that Charlotte, in the joyful chaos of the moment, couldn't quite hear. It was the last thing she would ever say to her. Her disappearance wasn't dramatic. There was no scream, no struggle, no sound to break the spell of the celebration. One moment, Amelia was seen walking toward the old oak tree at the edge of the property, perhaps seeking a moment of quiet. The next, she was simply gone. The band played on. The cake was cut. Guests began to leave. It wasn't until the last of the fairy lights were being extinguished that a cold dread began to settle in. Where was Amelia? The initial calls to her name were casual, then concerned, then frantic. The search started with a handful of family members combing the grounds with flashlights, their wedding attire growing damp with dew. The joyous occasion curdled into a nightmare, the laughter replaced by the chilling sound of a name being called into the empty, silent darkness. The following morning, the estate was no longer a wedding venue. It was a crime scene. Police cruisers crushed the manicured lawns, their flashing lights a garish intrusion on the pastoral setting. Detective Frank Kowalski, a weary but sharp investigator, led the initial inquiry. He questioned a dazed Charlotte and a defensive David, along with dozens of guests whose recollections were blurred by champagne and celebration. Every inch of the sprawling property was searched, but no trace of Amelia Hayes was ever found. No body, no weapon, no note. She had vanished from the face of the earth. The silver locket was never logged as evidence because everyone, including Charlotte, assumed it was still with her, wherever she was. It was just another personal item that disappeared along with the girl who wore it. Now, in August 2008, that assumption was shattered. Charlotte froze as Noah proudly presented his discovery. The world tilted on its axis. Time collapsed, and for a heart-stopping moment, she was back in her wedding dress, the phantom pain of her sister's absence as fresh as it was 9 years ago. Her own locket suddenly felt ice-cold against her chest. She took the muddy object from her son's hand, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely hold it. It was Amelia's. There was no doubt. The tiny, specific scratch near the clasp, from a time she'd dropped it as a child, was still there. It hadn't been lost somewhere far away. It had been here, all this time, buried just a few feet from where Amelia was last seen. With a shaking thumb, Charlotte pressed the hidden clasp. The locket sprang open. She braced herself for the sight she expected. A miniature, faded photograph of their parents, a perfect copy of the one inside her own. Seeing it would have been painful, a confirmation of the life that was stolen. But the space for the picture was empty. A small, square indentation was all that remained, the photo long gone. Her heart sank, a new wave of confusion washing over the grief. Why would Amelia remove the photo? It made no sense. The locket was a symbol of their family, their bond. For it to be empty felt like a desecration, another piece of the puzzle that was intentionally twisted and broken, leaving her with more questions than answers. But it wasn't empty. As her eyes adjusted, she saw something else nestled in the velvet lining where the photo should have been. It wasn't a picture. It was something small, metallic, and glinting in the afternoon sun. Carefully, she tipped the locket, and a tiny, ornate brass key fell into her palm. It was not a key to a door or a car. It was smaller, more delicate, the kind of key that belonged to a diary, a music box, or something far more secret. It was a key to a safe deposit box. In that instant, the entire narrative of the past 9 years shifted. Amelia hadn't just disappeared. She had left something behind. A clue, a message, sealed in silver and buried in the earth, waiting for someone to find it. The question was no longer just what happened to her, but what secret was so important that she had to hide it this way? The key felt impossibly heavy in Charlotte's palm, a small object carrying the weight of 9 lost years. The air, thick with the humid scent of an August afternoon, seemed to thin, making it hard to breathe. The world around her, the cheerful sound of her son's voice, the gentle rustle of leaves from the ancient oak tree, the distant drone of a lawnmower, receded into a muffled, indistinct hum. All of her focus narrowed onto the tiny, ornate piece of brass. It was an anomaly, a fragment from a forgotten timeline that had just violently collided with her present. It didn't belong here, in the carefully constructed piece of her life. A life she had built brick by painful brick over the ruins of what came before. This key was a ghost made solid, a tangible piece of the nightmare she thought she had finally outrun. Her fingers instinctively closed around it, the sharp, decorative edges pressing into her skin, grounding her in the horrifying reality of the moment. This wasn't a memory or a trick of the light. The metal was real, still holding a faint warmth from the sun. Yet a deep, familiar cold began to spread from her hand, seeping into her bones. It was the same chilling sensation she remembered from that night, June 12, 1999, as the flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness and her own desperate calls for Amelia were swallowed by the indifferent silence of the woods. The past wasn't buried 6 feet under. It was barely an inch below the surface, and her 8-year-old son had just handed her the shovel that broke the ground. "Mom, is it a real treasure?" Noah's voice, so full of innocent excitement, finally pierced through the fog of her shock. "Can we use it to open a secret chest?" His question landed like a physical blow, winding her. How could she possibly explain to him that this treasure was not the beginning of an adventure, but the reopening of a wound. That this key might unlock not a chest of gold, but a Pandora's box of pain and dark secrets. She looked down at his bright, curious face and felt a primal surge of fear. He had stumbled into a darkness he was never meant to know. Forcing a brittle smile, a mask she'd worn for nearly a decade, she tried to shield him from the abyss that had just opened at their feet. It's very old, sweetie. Very special. She managed to choke out, her voice a strained, unfamiliar whisper. Her movements were jerky and robotic as she quickly scooped the locket and the key into the pocket of her jeans. The action was pure instinct. To hide, to conceal, to protect. It was the same reflex that had guided her for years, forcing her to bury her grief and her gnawing uncertainty so she could function, so she could be a wife and a mother. But this was different. The evidence was no longer a phantom feeling or a fleeting memory. It was a solid object, a heavy, metallic weight against her thigh, a constant, physical reminder that the story was not over. Her mind ignited, a frantic storm of questions and terrifying possibilities. A key. Amelia had hidden a key. But why? And where did it lead? The empty space where a photo of their parents should have been now seemed profoundly sinister. This wasn't an accident. Amelia had deliberately removed the picture, a symbol of their family bond, and replaced it with this. It was an intentional act, a message sent from the edge of oblivion. A chilling, sickening realization began to form in the depths of her mind. Amelia must have known. She must have suspected something terrible was going to happen to her. She wasn't just a victim of a random tragedy. She was preparing for her own demise. The dam of composure she had so carefully maintained for 348 days finally began to splinter. Hot, sudden tears blurred her vision. Not just the familiar tears of grief for her lost twin, but tears of a new and volatile emotion, rage. A white-hot anger at Amelia for leaving behind such a cryptic, agonizing puzzle instead of a name or a warning. An overwhelming fury at the faceless monster who took her away. And a deep, corrosive anger at herself for giving up hope, for allowing the official narrative of a cold case to become her reality, for trying to build a new life when the truth was lying just yards away, waiting in the dirt. She cast her gaze back toward the sprawling oak tree, its branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the afternoon sky. For her entire life, it had been a symbol of permanence and happy childhood memories. Now, it looked like a monstrous tombstone, a silent, gnarled witness that had guarded its terrible secret while she mourned in ignorance. How many times had she sat in its shade, trying to feel close to Amelia? How many family picnics had they had on the grass right above the spot? The sheer proximity of the truth was suffocating, a cruel twist of fate that felt both personal and malevolent. It had been right there. It was always right there. The life she had so painstakingly built felt like an elaborate fiction. The promise she had made to herself in the aftermath of the tragedy, to survive, to find happiness, to honor Amelia by living fully, now seemed like a profound betrayal. She had constructed her family's home on a foundation of unresolved trauma and unanswered questions, and now that foundation was cracking wide open. This discovery offered no comfort, no sense of impending closure. It was the violent tearing open of a wound, exposing the raw, infected tissue beneath. The story she had clung to for sanity, that Amelia ran away or met with a random, senseless fate, evaporated in the face of this tiny brass key. This key changed the entire narrative. It was a direct communication from the other side, a deliberate breadcrumb left on a trail that had long gone cold. Amelia hadn't simply vanished into thin air. She had left a path, a secret map that the police, with all their resources, had completely missed. A path that, perhaps, only a twin sister was ever meant to find. The weight in her pocket was no longer just the burden of grief. It was the weight of a mission, a sacred, terrifying duty to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly. The question was no longer just what happened to Amelia, but what secrets did she die to protect? Her eyes darted toward the house, where her husband David was now emerging, his brow furrowed with concern as he saw her standing frozen in the yard. In that instant, the circle of trust she had carefully drawn around her family shattered. Everyone was a potential suspect again. David, who was there that night, the charismatic and unsettling family friend, Marcus Thorne. Every single guest at her wedding. The hard-won piece of her marriage suddenly felt as fragile as glass. The key wasn't just a clue to the past, it was a potential detonator for her present. Who could she possibly trust with this? Who wasn't implicated in the silence? As David walked closer, calling her name, Charlotte clenched her fist inside her pocket, her knuckles white around the sharp edges of the key. A decision solidified in her heart, hard and clear as diamond. For 9 years, she had been a passive character in this tragedy, defined by her loss. Now she had to become its driving force. The fear was still a cold, coiling serpent in her gut, but for the first time, it was joined by a spark of fierce, unyielding resolve. She would follow this trail to its end. She would unlock whatever door this key belonged to, and she would face whatever monster was waiting on the other side. She owed it to Amelia. The long silence was finally, irrevocably, over. But this was just the beginning of what was to come. What would you do if you found a clue to a loved one's disappearance after 9 years of silence? Could you handle the weight of that key? If this story has already grabbed you, show your support by liking and subscribing, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what you think the key unlocks. Now, to understand the full weight of this moment, we have to go back to the beginning. June 12th, 1999. The Hayes family estate in the Hudson Valley was a vision torn from a storybook, a sprawling canvas of manicured green lawns and ancient weeping willows. On this particular Saturday, the property was alive, transformed into the perfect backdrop for a wedding. Elegant white tents billowed gently in the warm breeze, tables were adorned with cascading roses, and the air hummed with the sophisticated melody of a string quartet. It was a day meticulously crafted to celebrate love and new beginnings, a testament to the family's standing and their hopes for the future. The sun cast a golden glow over everything, promising a long and cloudless afternoon. In this idyllic setting, surrounded by the gentle hills of New York, the very concept of tragedy felt like a foreign language, an impossible intrusion into a world that seemed, for one perfect day, utterly flawless and secure. At the heart of this celebration was Charlotte Hayes, the bride. Dressed in a cascade of white silk and lace, she was radiant, her happiness so palpable it seemed to light up the space around her. Every glance she shared with her new husband, David Miller, was filled with the kind of profound, unshakable love that fairy tales are made of. She moved through the crowd with an easy grace, her laughter mingling with the clinking of champagne glasses. For Charlotte, this day was the culmination of all her dreams, the official start of a life she had long envisioned. The shadow of her twins' disappearance had not yet been cast. In this moment, she was whole, blissfully unaware that the foundation of her world was about to be fractured beyond repair, and that this perfect day would become the source of her deepest, most enduring pain. Standing beside her, a perfect reflection in a pale blue bridesmaid dress, was Amelia Hayes. To the guests, she was the other half of a beautiful set, the devoted twin sister playing her part as maid of honor with practiced perfection. Their bond was legendary within their circle. They were two souls sharing one life, their connection symbolized by the identical silver heart lockets they wore, a cherished gift from their grandmother. Amelia smiled for the photographs, offered a heartfelt toast, and dutifully danced with their father. Yet, for those who looked closely, a subtle tension pulled at the corners of her smile. A fleeting, haunted look would cross her face before being quickly masked, her fingers often straying to the locket at her throat, as if seeking reassurance from the cool, familiar metal. The groom, David Miller, was the picture of contentment. Young, successful, and undeniably handsome, he seemed a perfect match for Charlotte. His love for her was evident in every touch and every shared smile. He was welcomed into the Hayes family, seen as the steady, reliable man who would build a secure future with their daughter. On that day, he mingled easily with guests, his arm possessively around Charlotte, the embodiment of a bright new chapter. He shared a laugh with Amelia, the dynamic between the three of them appearing as effortless and harmonious as everything else at the wedding. No one could have known that David's memory of this day would become a crucial, yet complicated piece of the puzzle, or that his perspective on the final hours of Amelia's visible life would one day be placed under a microscope, scrutinized for cracks. Moving through the periphery of this happy scene was Marcus Thorne, a longtime family friend, whose presence added a discordant note to the otherwise perfect harmony of the day. Decades older than the twins, Marcus had cultivated an image as a charismatic and generous local businessman, a pillar of the community. But beneath the charming veneer, there was a predatory stillness, an intensity in his gaze that lingered a moment too long, especially when it fell upon Charlotte and Amelia. His attraction to the sisters was an open secret, often dismissed as harmless paternal affection, but it was closer to an obsession. He watched them with a proprietary air, his smile never quite reaching his cold, calculating eyes, making him a subtle, unsettling shadow in the bright sunshine. As the afternoon wore on, the carefully constructed facade of perfection began to show its first hairline cracks. Several guests later reported seeing Amelia in a brief, yet visibly tense, conversation with Marcus Thorne near the tree line at the edge of the sprawling property. Their voices were low and urgent, their body language stiff with disagreement. The argument, if that's what it was, ended as quickly as it began, with Marcus placing a placating hand on Amelia's arm before she pulled away and returned to the reception. She smoothed over the moment with a brittle smile, but the encounter left a residue of unease. Her fingers went back to her locket, her thumb tracing its heart shape over and over again, a nervous tick that went largely unnoticed in the celebratory chaos. The atmosphere was deliberately cultivated to be one of overwhelming joy, a sensory immersion in happiness. The air was thick with the sweet, heady scent of thousands of roses and freshly cut grass. The soundscape was a gentle symphony of laughter, murmured congratulations, and the soaring notes of Vivaldi. Guests sipped expensive champagne, the bubbles catching the afternoon light as they toasted the happy couple. It was the peak of a perfect life, a moment frozen in time where every element conspired to create a memory of pure, unadulterated bliss. This vibrant, living picture of happiness was the before, the world that existed prior to the silence, making the darkness that followed all the more stark and incomprehensible. It was a day designed for beautiful memories, not for haunting mysteries. The final interaction between the twins was tragically mundane, lost in the blur of the celebration. Just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Amelia pulled Charlotte into a tight embrace. She hugged her sister fiercely, burying her face in her shoulder for a moment. She whispered something into Charlotte's ear, a phrase muffled by the music and the joyful noise of the crowd. Charlotte, caught up in the whirlwind of her own happiness, didn't quite catch the words and simply smiled, squeezing her sister's hand before turning back to her guests. She had no way of knowing it was a farewell. That simple, missed sentence would echo in her mind for years, a ghost of a warning she never received, marking the final, quiet moment before Amelia Hayes walked away from the lights of the party and vanished forever. The Hayes family estate was more than just a property. It was a dynasty carved into the Hudson Valley landscape, spanning over 200 acres of rolling hills, dense private woodlands, and pristine riverfront. It had been in the family for 3 generations. The main house, a grand stone manor, was a fortress of old money and tradition, its rooms filled with inherited furniture, portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and the faint, lingering scent of beeswax and secrets. For Charlotte and Amelia, it was the entire world of their childhood, a magical, sprawling playground. But as they grew older, the estate's isolation began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. It was a place that protected them from the outside world, but also a place where problems could be contained, hidden away from public view, and left to fester in the silent, watchful woods. The Hayes family operated on a strict code of appearances. Their parents, Richard and Eleanor Hayes, were pillars of their affluent community, their lives a carefully curated performance of philanthropy, social grace, and quiet influence. Public perception was paramount. Therefore, when tragedy struck, the instinct was not to shatter the facade, but to manage the narrative. The twins were the family's crowning achievement, beautiful, intelligent, and inseparable. Their bond was a source of pride, a living testament to the perfect family image. This deep-seated need to maintain control and project an image of flawlessness would later become a significant obstacle in the investigation, creating a barrier of polite, yet firm, resistance against any inquiry that threatened to expose the family's private vulnerabilities or hidden fractures. While Charlotte and Amelia were seen as two halves of a whole, their personalities were distinct mirrors of one another. Charlotte was the pragmatist, grounded and methodical, the one who planned for the future and anchored their shared world in reality. Amelia, in contrast, was the dreamer, an artist with a restless spirit and a penchant for secrets. She felt things more deeply and was more prone to bouts of melancholy and impulsive decisions. This dynamic, while complementary, created a subtle imbalance. Charlotte often felt a need to protect her more volatile twin, while Amelia sometimes chafed under what she perceived as her sister's cautious nature. Their identical silver lockets were a symbol of their unity, but beneath the surface, each sister was navigating a world the other couldn't fully comprehend, a divergence that would ultimately prove fatal. David Miller entered this intricate family dynamic as a welcome breath of fresh air, yet he was undeniably an outsider. He came from a modest, middle-class background, and his love for Charlotte was genuine and uncomplicated. However, he was often visibly awed, and perhaps a little intimidated, by the scale of the Hayes, wealth, and the unspoken rules that governed their world. He tried his best to fit in, to be the steady and reliable partner Charlotte deserved. His relationship with Amelia was cordial but distant. He respected the twins' intense bond and was careful not to overstep. On the day of the wedding, he was a man on the precipice of a new life, blissfully unaware that he was also stepping onto a stage where he would become a key witness. His memories of that day, destined to be scrutinized for years to come. Marcus Thorne's presence in their lives was a constant, a fixture as old as the oak trees on the estate. He had known the girls since they were children, a close friend of their father who had seamlessly transitioned into a mentor-like figure. He was generous with his time and money, and his charismatic, worldly persona was captivating. But his affection for the twins always carried a disturbing undercurrent of ownership. He watched them with an intensity that went beyond paternal fondness, a predator cloaked in the guise of a benevolent family friend. His power in the local community was substantial. He was a man whose favors came with strings attached, a man people were afraid to cross. This untouchable status allowed his obsession to grow unchecked, hidden in plain sight, dismissed by all as simply the way Marcus is. In the weeks preceding the wedding, a palpable anxiety had settled over Amelia. While everyone attributed it to the stress of her maid-of-honor duties, Charlotte sensed something deeper. Amelia grew more withdrawn, her artistic pursuits abandoned in favor of long, solitary walks in the woods. There were hushed, late-night phone calls she would end abruptly if anyone entered the room, and a new, guarded look in her eyes that even Charlotte couldn't penetrate. She had started keeping a diary, a small leather-bound book she kept hidden, a new secret in a lifetime of shared thoughts. It was a subtle but definite shift, a quiet pulling away. Amelia was scared. It wasn't a vague premonition. It was a specific, targeted fear of something, or someone, that she felt she couldn't share, not even with the other half of her soul. The initial police response to Amelia's disappearance was hampered from the very start. Detective Frank Kowalski, a seasoned but world-weary investigator, arrived at a scene that was both a high-society event and a chaotic potential crime scene. Evidence had been compromised before he even stepped foot on the property, with dozens of guests trampling the grounds during their initial frantic search. Testimonies were a confused mess, blurred by champagne and the emotional chaos of the evening. The Hayes family, while cooperating, presented a united, protective front, their grief filtered through a lens of practiced social decorum. Kowalski sensed he wasn't getting the whole story, that vital information was being withheld out of fear, loyalty, or a desperate need to control the family's narrative. The case was born in confusion and shrouded in influence, making it cold before it ever had a chance to get hot. In the vacuum of evidence, a convenient, if painful, narrative began to take shape. Amelia, known for her artistic temperament and emotional depth, had simply run away. Perhaps the pressure of her sister's wedding, the start of a new life that she wasn't a part of, had become too much. It was a story that offered a semblance of an explanation without pointing a finger, a theory that allowed the community to mourn without having to look for a monster among them. This became the official, unspoken truth, the version that allowed Charlotte to eventually try and piece her life back together. But deep down, she never believed it. She knew her sister. Amelia might have been a dreamer, but she wasn't a coward. She wouldn't have just left without a word, abandoning the one person on earth she truly loved. The drive back to the house was a blur, a 10-minute journey that felt like an eternity. Charlotte clutched the steering wheel, her knuckles white, the small, ornate key a burning secret in her pocket. She couldn't tell David. Not yet. The thought was immediate and absolute, a cold wall of certainty that rose in her mind. For 9 years, their shared grief had been a bond, but this new discovery introduced a toxic element: suspicion. David had been there that night. He was one of the last people to see Amelia alive. Until she knew what this key unlocked, until she understood the full scope of the secret Amelia had buried, she couldn't trust anyone. The loneliness of this realization was crushing, a heavy cloak of isolation settling over her. For the first time since her sister vanished, she was truly, utterly alone in her search, guided only by a ghost's cryptic clue. That night, sleep was an impossibility. With David and Noah asleep, she sat at the kitchen table under the sterile glow of a single overhead light, the key and locket laid out before her like sacred relics. The key was a delicate thing, but under a magnifying glass, she saw a tiny inscription stamped into the brass, the number 734, and the faint, stylized initials FNB. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was a tangible lead, the first solid piece of information in nearly a decade. She spent hours on her laptop, the click of the keyboard, the only sound in the silent house, plunging into a rabbit hole of archived business directories and old bank mergers. The initials FNB were generic, leading to dozens of dead ends. But she persisted, driven by a frantic, desperate energy, a refusal to let this first flicker of hope die out in the darkness of the internet. Just as the first hint of dawn began to gray the sky, she found it. A digital archive of a 1990s Albany newspaper mentioned the acquisition of the First National Bank of Albany by a larger financial conglomerate. The article noted that all safe deposit box accounts from the original institution were to be maintained at their central downtown branch, Albany. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was a 2-hour drive north, a city with no apparent connection to Amelia's life. Why would her sister hide something so important in a place she seemingly never visited? The discovery didn't simplify the mystery. It deepened it, adding a new layer of calculated secrecy to Amelia's final days. This wasn't a random choice. It was a deliberate move, to a place no one would ever think to look. The lie to David felt like a shard of glass in her throat. "I have to run some errands in the city, some things for the estate sale," she said, the words tasting like poison. The look of mild confusion on his face was a fresh stab of guilt, but it was overshadowed by the fierce protective resolve that now consumed her. The drive north along the Hudson River was a surreal journey through a landscape that had always meant home. but now felt like foreign territory. The familiar rolling hills and quaint towns blurred into an indifferent backdrop for the storm raging inside her. Each mile marker ticked by, a countdown to a confrontation with the past. She was driving away from the life she had built, and toward the truth she had, for 9 long years, been too afraid to find. The bank was an imposing, modern tower of glass and steel, a sterile monument to corporate finance that bore no resemblance to the quaint regional institution it had once been. Clutching her purse, the key a cold weight inside, Charlotte felt small and anachronistic. The process was a gauntlet of bureaucratic indifference. She presented the legal documents declaring her the executor of Amelia's estate, along with the presumptive death certificate issued 5 years after her disappearance. The bank manager, a polite but distant woman, examined the papers with detached professionalism, her expression unreadable. This cold procedural reality, the forms, the signatures, the identity checks, was a jarring contrast to the raw, chaotic emotion churning in Charlotte's gut. She was here to unlock a ghost's last secret, and they were asking for 2 forms of ID. Finally, she was led through a heavy, circular vault door into the silent, climate-controlled heart of the bank. The air was still and cold, smelling faintly of metal and recycled air. Rows upon rows of gleaming stainless steel boxes lined the walls, a silent library of secrets. The manager stopped at a panel and pointed. "Box 734, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The manager inserted the bank's master key, then gestured for Charlotte to use hers. Her hand trembled as she slid the tiny brass key into the lock. The metallic click as it turned was explosive in the silence, a sound that seemed to break a 9-year spell. It was the sound of a door to the past, finally, irrevocably, swinging open. The manager slid the long, thin metal box from its slot and carried it to a small, private viewing room, placing it on a polished wooden table before discreetly closing the door behind her. Charlotte was left alone with the box, her own reflection staring back at her from its polished surface. For a long moment she couldn't bring herself to open it. What if it was empty? What if it contained something horrible? Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted the lid. Her eyes scanned the contents. A wave of dizzying relief and profound disappointment washing over her. There was no stack of money, no incriminating photographs, no weapon. The box was almost empty, save for a single item resting in the center, a small, dark blue, leather-bound diary. She recognized it instantly. It was the one Amelia had started keeping in the last few weeks of her life. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, reached for the book. It felt solid, real, a direct physical link to her sister's final thoughts. The leather was cool to the touch. With a sense of sacred dread, she opened it, her eyes falling on the last entry. The handwriting a familiar, elegant script that made her heart ache. The date at the top of the page was a punch to the gut, June 11th, 1999. The day before the wedding. The day before she vanished. Charlotte's eyes scanned the first line, and the air left her lungs in a single, silent gasp. The words seemed to lift off the page, burning themselves into her mind, confirming her darkest, most deeply buried fear. Asterisk Marcus knows I have the proof. Asterisk Amelia had written. Asterisk, he said he'll do anything to stop me. I'm scared, Charlie. For the first time in my life, I'm truly scared. The world inside the small, sterile viewing room seemed to shrink, the air growing thin and heavy. Charlotte's vision tunneled, focusing solely on the words scrawled in her sister's familiar hand. Marcus knows. The name was a detonation in the silent chamber of her mind. It wasn't a shocking revelation, so much as a horrifying confirmation of a dark whisper she had suppressed for 9 long years. The vague unease she'd always felt around him, the possessive glint in his eye she'd dismissed as paternal affection, it all coalesced into a single, monstrous truth. The grief she had carried for so long began to transmute into something harder and sharper, a cold, crystalline rage. The leather-bound diary in her hands no longer felt like a sad memento. It felt like a weapon, handed to her across the veil of time by the sister she had failed to protect. With a shaking hand, she turned back the pages, her eyes scanning the entries from the weeks leading up to the wedding. Amelia's elegant script painted a chilling portrait of escalating fear. She detailed Marcus Thorne's relentless attention, describing how his gifts and favors began to feel like a silken cage, each one creating a debt she could never repay. He would appear at the cafe where she sketched, or the bookstore she frequented, his presence a constant, looming shadow. Amelia wrote of his charisma as a predatory tool, a mask he used to charm their father and insinuate himself into the very fabric of their lives. She felt trapped, watched, and isolated, her growing panic dismissed by everyone as pre-wedding jitters. She was describing a methodical campaign of psychological terror executed by a man everyone else saw as a benevolent friend. Then she found it. The reason for Amelia's terror, spelled out in stark, factual detail. Amelia had accidentally discovered Marcus's true business. While helping her father organize some joint venture paperwork at his office, she had stumbled upon a hidden ledger. It wasn't about real estate or local investments. It was a meticulously kept record of an illicit arms trafficking operation. Marcus was using the Hayes family's legitimate shipping business as a front, moving illegal weapons to conflict zones under the guise of industrial machinery. Amelia described seeing photocopied shipping manifests and wire transfers to shell corporations in Panama and the Cayman Islands, totaling millions of dollars. She had found the source of his wealth and power, a secret so dark it was worth killing to protect. She wrote that she had taken copies of the most damning pages, hiding them away. A wave of vertigo washed over Charlotte, and she gripped the edge of the polished table to steady herself. This was so much bigger, so much more sinister than a personal vendetta or a crime of passion. Her sister, the gentle artist who painted landscapes and wrote poetry, had single-handedly uncovered a criminal empire. The memory of Marcus at her wedding, raising a champagne glass to toast her future, became a grotesque parody. He had stood there, smiling, accepting their family's hospitality, all while being actively threatened with exposure by the young woman in the pale blue bridesmaid dress, standing just a few feet away. The sheer audacity, the psychopathic control it must have taken to maintain that facade was almost incomprehensible. He was a monster wearing the mask of a friend. The pieces of that day now reassembled themselves in her mind with brutal clarity. The hushed, tense conversation she'd seen between Amelia and Marcus near the tree line wasn't just an argument. It was an ultimatum. Amelia, brave and terrified, must have confronted him. She must have told him she knew, that she had the proof. And he, with his empire on the line, had issued his own ultimatum in return. The sprawling oak tree, the one that had been a symbol of her childhood, was now stained forever in her mind. It wasn't just the spot where the locket was found. It was the place of the final confrontation, the ground where her sister's life was likely taken. The locket hadn't been lost. It had been torn from her neck. The initial police investigation suddenly seemed like a tragic farce. Detective Kowalski, for all his experience, never stood a chance. Marcus Thorne was a pillar of the community, a man of immense local influence and wealth. Of course, his alibi would have been accepted without question. Of course, the narrative he subtly pushed, that the fragile, emotional Amelia had simply run away, was the one that took hold. He had expertly manipulated the situation from the very beginning, using their own grief and shock against them, directing the search away from himself. He had turned their family home into a crime scene, and then played the part of the concerned friend, watching the flawed investigation unfold with the cold confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. Her fingers, almost numb, brushed against the inside back cover of the diary. She felt a small, stiff rectangle of paper tucked into a tight leather pocket. Carefully, she slid it out. It was a receipt, old and slightly yellowed, from Pioneer Self-Storage, on the industrial outskirts of Poughkeepsie. The date printed on it was June 10, 1999, 2 days before the wedding. It was a cash payment for a 1-year lease on Unit C-17. This was it. This had to be it. The ledger pages, the proof Amelia had died to protect, were not in the diary. The diary was the key, the map leading to the real treasure. Amelia had created a chain of clues, a final, desperate failsafe, designed to lead someone, to lead her, to the truth. The cold air of the vault suddenly felt suffocating. The relief of finding a concrete lead was immediately crushed by a new and overwhelming fear. This wasn't a historical artifact. It was an active threat. Marcus Thorne was still out there, more powerful and more insulated than ever. Going to that storage unit, retrieving that evidence, would be like pulling the pin on a grenade that had been dormant for 9 years. He wouldn't hesitate to silence her just as he had silenced Amelia. The secret she now held was not just the key to justice for her sister. It was a direct threat to her own life, to David, and to Noah. She closed the diary, the weight of it feeling immense in her hands. The path to the truth was finally clear, but walking it might cost her everything. The drive away from the Albany Bank was a descent into a new kind of reality for Charlotte. The leather-bound diary and the small, creased receipt sat on the passenger seat, not as relics of the past, but as live, ticking explosives. Her initial shock, the wave of grief and rage in the sterile viewing room, began to cool and harden into something far more dangerous, a cold, calculated purpose. She couldn't walk into a police station with this. Not yet. The diary had made it brutally clear that Marcus Thorne was not just a murderer. He was an institution, his influence woven into the very fabric of the community that was supposed to provide justice. To reveal her hand now would be suicide. She needed the proof from that storage unit first. She needed an ally, someone who knew the terrain of the original failure. Her mind settled on one name: Frank Kowalski. Finding the retired detective was easier than she expected, but harder than she hoped. A quick search of public records led her to a small, isolated cabin in the Catskills, a place where a man would go to forget the world or to be forgotten by it. When she called, his voice was gravelly, thick with cynicism, and the rasp of a man who had smoked too many cigarettes while staring at a case file that would never close. The name Charlotte Hayes was a phantom from a past he had tried to bury. He was immediately resistant, his words a barrage of weary warnings. "Leave it alone, Mrs. Miller," he'd rasped. "Some doors you don't want to open. You have a family, a life. Your sister wouldn't want you to throw that away chasing ghosts." His reluctance was a wall, but she heard the flicker of something else beneath it, the ghost of a case that still haunted him. Persistence was her only weapon. She drove the 2 hours to his remote cabin, finding him on a porch overlooking a gray, misty valley. He looked older than his years, worn down by a career of seeing the worst in people. She didn't plead or cry. She simply placed the tarnished silver locket on the rickety wooden table between them. Then, the key. And finally, the diary. She opened it to the last page, the one dated June 11th, 1999, and pointed to the name Marcus. Kowalski stared at the word, his weary facade cracking. The old investigator's instinct, dormant for years, began to stir. He picked up the diary, his touch surprisingly gentle, and the haunted look in his eyes sharpened into something she hadn't seen before. Focus. He finally saw that she wasn't chasing a ghost. She was holding a map left by the victim. With a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 9 years of regret, Kowalski began to talk. He confessed the true story of the failed investigation. A narrative of quiet, systemic corruption. Marcus Thorne's alibi, a dinner with 2 powerful county officials, had been ironclad and delivered with condescending confidence. Every time Kowalski tried to probe Thorne's business dealings or question his associates, he hit a bureaucratic brick wall. Resources were mysteriously reallocated. Key files were temporarily misplaced. His superiors strongly advised him to focus on the runaway angle. It wasn't a botched investigation. It was a smothered one. "He's not just a man, Charlotte," Kowalski warned, his voice low and serious. "He's a spider, and his web covers this entire valley. You're not just tugging on a single thread. You're threatening his whole world." Armed with Kowalski's grim validation, Charlotte knew her next step was one she could not take alone. The storage unit in Poughkeepsie was no longer just a destination, it was a potential trap. To her profound relief, Kowalski, seemingly pulled from retirement by the gravitational force of his one great failure, agreed to accompany her. The drive to the Pioneer self-storage facility was tense and silent. It was a bleak, utilitarian place on the industrial edge of town, a landscape of concrete, chain-link fences, and rows of anonymous, corrugated steel doors. It was the perfect purgatory for secrets, a place where things went to be forgotten. As they stood before Unit C-17, its lock rusted with age, Charlotte felt a tremor of fear. They were about to break the seal on a tomb, and she had no idea what kind of monster they might awaken. The old lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the metal door rolled up with a deafening, groaning screech that echoed in the desolate facility. The air that rushed out was stale, carrying the faint, musty scent of time and stillness. The contents were sparse, a chilling tableau of a life interrupted. There was a small duffel bag, a go-bag. Inside, Charlotte found a change of clothes, a thick wad of cash, totaling nearly $10,000, a burner phone, and a surprisingly high-quality fake driver's license. The name on the license was Catherine Pierce, and the face was Amelia's, but with her hair dyed dark brown. The realization struck Charlotte with the force of a physical blow. Amelia hadn't just planned to expose Marcus. She had planned to run, to vanish completely, creating a new identity to escape the inevitable fallout. She knew she was a dead woman if she stayed. Beneath the go-bag lay the true reason they were there. Tucked inside a heavy-duty, waterproof document case was the evidence. It was exactly as Amelia had described in her diary. A stack of photocopied shipping manifests from the Hayes family's logistics company, but with notations and destinations that were clearly fraudulent. There were copies of wire transfers to offshore shell corporations in jurisdictions known for their secrecy. Most damning of all was a handwritten ledger page, a meticulous record of payments and names. Charlotte's blood ran cold as she recognized some of them. It wasn't just Marcus. The list included a prominent local judge and a man who, in 1999, was a rising star in the district attorney's office. This wasn't just a crime, it was a conspiracy, a web of corruption that reached into the very heart of the justice system. Just as Kowalski was carefully placing the documents back into the case, a sound sliced through the silence of the storage unit, a high-pitched, electronic ringing. It was the burner phone from Amelia's go-bag. After 9 years of dead silence, it was inexplicably, impossibly, receiving a call. They both froze, staring at the small, obsolete device as it vibrated on the concrete floor. The screen lit up, showing only a blocked number. A cold dread, more profound than any she had yet felt, washed over Charlotte. This couldn't be a coincidence. It was a signal. It meant that someone, somewhere, knew this 9-year-old tomb had just been opened. Kowalski shook his head, mouthing the word, "No." But Charlotte, compelled by a desperate, reckless need for answers, snatched up the phone and pressed the answer button. There was no voice, no greeting. Instead, a distorted, synthesized sound, like a robotic rasp, filled the small speaker. It was devoid of all emotion, a cold, machine-like utterance that made the hair on Charlotte's arm stand on end. It spoke only 7 words, each one landing like a shard of ice in her ear. "We know you found the box. Leave it." Then, a click, and the line went dead. The silence that followed was heavier and more menacing than before. They weren't just uncovering a past crime. They had stumbled into an active, ongoing conspiracy. They had been watched. Someone had tracked her from the bank in Albany. The threat wasn't a ghost from 1999. It was alive, it was aware, and it was now focused directly on her. The danger was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. Returning home that evening was like crossing into a different dimension. The familiar comfort of her house felt like a fragile illusion, a stage set that could be torn down at any moment. The strain was unbearable, and David saw it the moment she walked in the door. The confrontation was inevitable, a storm that had been brewing for days. He demanded to know where she was, what secret she was hiding that carved such a chasm between them. Pushed to her breaking point by fear and adrenaline, Charlotte finally turned on him, her voice trembling with accusation. "You never told me everything," she said. "You were there. You saw something that night." The color drained from David's face. The secret he had carried for 9 years finally broke free. "I saw her argue with Marcus," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "But then, I saw her get into a car. It wasn't his. I didn't recognize the driver. I was scared, Charlie. I thought they would think it was me." The confession detonated in the center of Charlotte's world, shattering what little ground she had left to stand on. Another person, a third man at the scene, an unknown driver, a complete ghost in the narrative. The entire case had been built on a false premise. Kowalski, listening to Charlotte's frantic, whispered phone call an hour later, knew they had crossed a threshold. This was too big, too active, and far too dangerous for a civilian and a retired cop to handle alone. The web was wider and more tangled than he had ever imagined. He made a decision. They needed official power, but someone clean, someone from outside the Hudson Valley's sphere of influence. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, reaching out to a former protege, Detective Sarah Chen, a brilliant, relentless investigator in a neighboring county, known for her mastery of digital forensics and her refusal to be intimidated. The personal search for Amelia was over. A full-blown, high-stakes criminal investigation was about to begin. Detective Sarah Chen was a force of nature, a sharp, focused cyclone of energy that blew into the stagnant, grief-filled air of the case. She met Charlotte and Kowalski not in a sterile police station, but in a discreet, rented office space in a neighboring county, a clean room insulated from the potential corruption of the Hudson Valley. Chen was the antithesis of the weary Kowalski. Where he was haunted by the past, she was driven by the data of the present. Her movements were precise, her questions were surgical, and her gaze missed nothing. She immediately confiscated the diary, the documents, and the burner phone, handling them with a forensic reverence that was both reassuring and terrifying. In that moment, Charlotte felt a profound shift. Her personal, chaotic quest for vengeance had just been deputized, transformed into a formal, high-stakes investigation led by a woman who treated secrets like solvable equations. The game had changed, and the stakes were about to be officially calculated. Chen's first priority was the technology. The burner phone, an artifact from a bygone era of telecommunications, was the most immediate threat and the most promising lead. "This call wasn't a coincidence," she explained, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard as she connected the device to a diagnostic rig. "An active SIM card, even one that's been dormant for 9 years, maintains a network presence. When you powered it on, it's likely you tripped a silent, digital tripwire. A simple if-then script. If this phone connects to a tower, send an alert. The call you received wasn't someone dialing. It was an automated warning. This tells us our opposition isn't just violent. They are patient, methodical, and technologically savvy, far beyond what was common in 1999. They've had a sentry guarding this secret for almost a decade." Next, Chen projected the financial documents onto a large monitor, the complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts filling the screen. "This is professional-grade money laundering," she stated, her tone clinical but tinged with a grim respect. "Panama, the Caymans, Liechtenstein. These aren't just random choices. They're jurisdictions with ironclad corporate secrecy laws. Back in '99, getting information from them would have been impossible without a federal treaty, something a local DA or judge could easily block with red tape for years." She traced the flow of money with a laser pointer, showing how millions of dollars from the arms deals were funneled through a dozen layers before re-emerging as investment capital in Thorne's legitimate businesses. Amelia hadn't just uncovered a crime, she had found the blueprint to an untouchable financial empire, one that was still very much active. The formal interview with David Miller took place in the same secure office. with Kowalski sitting in, a silent, brooding presence. Under Chen's calm but relentless questioning, David's carefully constructed walls crumbled. He recounted the memory he had suppressed for 9 years, his voice cracking. The car was a dark sedan, maybe a Ford Crown Victoria, an older model even then. It was parked deep in the shadows of the tree line. Chen pressed for more. Anything else? A bumper sticker? A dent? David squeezed his eyes shut, picturing the scene. No, wait. Yes. Hanging from the rearview mirror. An air freshener. But it was weird. It was one of those little pine trees. But it was solid black. I'd never seen a black one before. It just stuck in my head. This tiny, peculiar detail, a black tree in the darkness, was the first new piece of eyewitness evidence in 9 years. The technological hunt for the caller hit a dead end, but a telling one. Chen's digital forensics team confirmed the call had been routed through a chain of international proxies, a method of obscuring a signal's origin that was, in 2008, the domain of intelligence agencies and high-level cyber criminals. The synthesized voice was even more troubling. Audio analysis revealed it was generated by a custom software, not a commercially available text-to-speech program. It was designed to be untraceable, a vocal ghost. Whoever we're dealing with has access to resources and expertise that go far beyond a simple arms dealer, Chen concluded, her expression grim. They built a digital fortress around this secret, and we just knocked on the front gate. They've known we were coming since the moment you turned on that phone. The enemy was no longer just a man. It was a sophisticated, invisible network. The conspiracy's reach became terrifyingly clear as Chen's team dug into the names from Amelia's ledger. The judge, Arthur Bellingham, had been appointed to the federal bench in 2002. The assistant DA, Robert Garrison, was now the state attorney general. Their careers hadn't just advanced, they had skyrocketed. Financial records, obtained via a discreet subpoena, showed that the political action committees that had championed their appointments were heavily funded by a series of real estate development companies. And the primary investor in all of those companies was none other than Marcus Thorne. He hadn't just bought their silence, he had invested in their power, placing his pawns in the highest echelons of the justice system. The web wasn't just in the Hudson Valley, it stretched to Albany and Washington, D.C. It was Kowalski, with his old-school cop's intuition, who found the next anomaly. While Chen's team focused on the digital trail, he sat with the physical copies of the shipping manifests, a magnifying glass in hand. "The weights are wrong," he announced, his voice a low growl. "Look here. This shipment to an agricultural partner in South America, the declared weight for tractor parts is 10 tons. But the bill of lading from the Port Authority has it at 10.5. He found the same discrepancy on 3 other manifests, always in excess of several hundred pounds on outgoing shipments. He wasn't just bringing weapons in, Kowalski theorized, a dark look in his eyes. He was shipping something else out, something heavy, something he needed to disappear just as much as the guns. The mystery had a new, unknown variable. For Charlotte, the investigation became a waking nightmare that infiltrated every corner of her life. The safety of her home felt like a thin, brittle shell. She saw threats in every shadow, her heart leaping into her throat every time the phone rang with an unknown number. Her marriage to David was a landscape of unspoken fears and fresh betrayals, the space between them filled with the ghost of his 9-year-old secret. She tried to shield Noah, to maintain a facade of normalcy for him, but the oppressive tension in the house was a poison seeping under the doors. The fierce drive for justice for Amelia was now in a constant, agonizing war with the primal, terrifying fear of what that justice would cost the family she had now. The question was no longer if she could find the truth, but if she could survive it. Then Chen's team got a break. They traced the batch of SIM cards, including the one in Amelia's burner phone, to a wholesale purchase made in 1998 by a private security firm called Aegis Tactical Solutions. Aegis had officially dissolved in 2001, but in its heyday, it was a shadowy outfit specializing in, quote, corporate risk management for high-net-worth individuals. Its founder was a man named Julian Croft, a former Special Forces operative with a murky past in Central America. And Aegis's biggest client, listed in their archived tax filings, was Thorne Industries. Marcus Thorne didn't just have lawyers and judges in his pocket. He had access to trained, professional operatives. The unknown driver in the dark sedan now had a face, the cold, efficient face of a man who solved problems for a living. The abstract threat became horrifyingly personal. One Tuesday evening, Charlotte came home from a tense meeting with Chen to find her front door slightly ajar. Her blood ran cold. She raced inside, her first thought a frantic, blinding panic for Noah. She found him safe, watching cartoons in the living room. David was working late. Nothing was stolen, nothing seemed out of place. She searched the house, her heart hammering against her ribs, until she walked into Noah's bedroom. And there, sitting on his nightstand, placed precisely next to the book he was reading, was a small, black, pine tree-shaped air freshener. It was an unmistakable message, a violation of the most sacred space in her world. They were watching. They knew David had talked, and they could get to her child any time they wanted. The air freshener sent a shockwave through the investigation. This was a direct, intimate act of terror, a clear signal that the enemy was escalating. The shaken Kowalski, his face pale with fury, retreated to his cabin and tore through his old, dusty case files from 1999. In a folder of miscellaneous and dismissed tips, he found it, a single, handwritten note from an anonymous call logged on June 14, 1999. The operator had deemed it a crank. The note read, "Saw a dark car near the old Thorne quarry late Saturday night. Looked like they were dumping something." The quarry, an abandoned property owned by Thorne, just miles from the Hayes estate. It had been searched, but only superficially. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into a horrifying new configuration in Kowalski's mind. The unknown driver, the weight discrepancy on the manifests, the quarry. A chilling theory began to surface. Maybe Amelia wasn't the only thing they had to bury that night. The air freshener was a declaration of war. It transformed the investigation from a quest for historical truth into a fight for survival. There was no more time for caution, no more moving in the shadows. For Charlotte, the image of that black pine tree in her son's room burned away every last vestige of fear, replacing it with a cold, unyielding fury. In the cramped, tense atmosphere of Chen's temporary office, the decision was made with grim finality. They were going to the quarry. Going through official channels was impossible. Thorne's influence was a poison that had seeped into the very foundations of local law enforcement. Chen, in a move of profound professional risk, decided to circumvent the system. She would secure a warrant, but not for a murder investigation. It would be an emergency environmental impact survey, citing potential chemical leaching from the abandoned site. A clever, fragile lie that would give them the legal cover they needed to break ground. It was a gamble that could end her career, but it was their only move. They arrived as dawn broke, the sky a bruised canvas of purple and gray. The Thorne quarry was a scar on the landscape, a vast, man-made crater carved out of the earth. Sheer cliffs of granite plunged into a pool of stagnant, unnaturally black water. Rusted skeletons of old machinery stood silent watch, their metal hides weeping orange streaks. The air was heavy and cold, thick with the smell of wet stone, mineral decay, and something else, something ancient and sorrowful. A relentless wind whistled through the skeletal remains of the processing plant, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to echo the silence of the last 9 years. This was not just an abandoned industrial site, it was a mausoleum, a place built to swallow secrets and hold them forever in its cold, dark belly. Charlotte felt a primal dread seep into her bones. This place was a grave. Detective Chen's small, hand-picked team moved with quiet, methodical efficiency, their professionalism a stark contrast to the chaotic landscape. They began with the ground-penetrating radar, starting on the overgrown access road mentioned in the anonymous tip from 1999. The device emitted a low, rhythmic pulse, its sound a high-tech heartbeat in the desolate silence. Charlotte watched the technician's screen, her own heart pounding in time with the machine's beeps. The display showed a shifting, abstract landscape of soil densities and buried rock, a subterranean world of secrets. Each anomaly, each spike in the data, sent a jolt of anxious energy through her. She wrapped her arms around herself, her gaze drifting inexorably toward the inky black water of the quarry pit, her imagination painting horrors beneath its still, unblinking surface. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow-motion collision with a truth she both craved and feared. While Chen's team put their faith in technology, Kowalski trusted his gut, the finely honed instinct of a man who had walked 1,000 crime scenes. He left the GPR crew and began a slow, deliberate patrol of the quarry's perimeter, his eyes scanning for the subtle inconsistencies that time often fails to erase. And he found it. Tucked away in a corner half swallowed by thorny bushes was a section of the old chain-link fence. The rust patterns were wrong. A 4-foot section had been cleanly cut and then crudely patched with newer, less corroded wire. It was a faint scar, almost invisible to a casual observer, but to Kowalski, it was a glaring sign of a long-ago intrusion. It was located just yards from where the anonymous caller had reported seeing the car. He raised a hand, his voice cutting through the wind, sharp and certain. "Chen! Over here!" "I think I found their door." The GPR team immediately relocated to the area by the repaired fence. The machine's rhythmic pulse seemed to grow more urgent, more insistent. Suddenly, the technician stopped, his body going rigid. "I've got something," he said, his voice tight. A big something. On the screen, a clear, unambiguous shape materialized from the digital noise. It was a large, rectangular mass of dense metal, buried approximately 10 feet below the surface. Its lines were too perfect, too symmetrical to be a natural formation. Its dimensions were unmistakable. It was a vehicle. A profound electric silence fell over the group, the whistling wind the only sound. Kowalski met Charlotte's gaze, his expression a mixture of grim triumph and deep sorrow. They had found the tomb. The ghost in the machine had finally revealed its resting place. The next phase was a frantic, high-stakes logistical ballet. Chen, operating on her fragile environmental warrant, had to get an excavator to the site without raising suspicion. She made a call, her voice a whip-crack of authority, commandeering a crew and a backhoe from a nearby county road project, citing a, quote, soil contamination risk that required immediate excavation. The lie was audacious, but it worked. Within 2 hours, the massive yellow machine was crawling toward the site, its diesel engine, a roar that shattered the quarry's long-held peace. As the excavator's heavy steel bucket bit into the earth for the first time, the sound was a violent, percussive shock. Each scoop of dirt felt like a violation, a brutal tearing away of the years. Charlotte stood frozen, watching the ground open up, feeling as if her own chest was being hollowed out with each deafening scrape of metal on rock. The digging felt like it lasted an eternity, each minute stretched thin by unbearable anticipation. Then it happened. The excavator's bucket struck something solid with a deafening, high-pitched screech of metal on metal that sent shivers down everyone's spine. The operator immediately cut the engine, and a heavy silence descended once more. The team swarmed the pit, swapping heavy machinery for hand shovels, their movements now delicate and precise. They cleared away the last layers of dirt and rock with the care of archaeologists unearthing a sacred relic. Slowly, painstakingly, a shape began to emerge from its earthen grave. First, the curved line of a roof. Then, the back window. It was a car, a dark blue sedan, its body pockmarked and ravaged by 9 years of subterranean decay, but its form was undeniable. It was a Ford Crown Victoria. More dirt was cleared, revealing the rear of the vehicle. The back window was caked with mud, but through a small, clear patch they could see into the dark interior. And there it was, hanging from the rearview mirror, swinging gently from the motion of the excavation, was a small, pine tree-shaped air freshener. It was solid black. The sight was a physical blow, a stunning, visceral confirmation that slammed every piece of the puzzle into place. David's repressed memory, the strange detail he could never forget, was not a trick of his mind. It was real. A choked, guttural sound escaped Charlotte's lips, a sob of such profound grief and validation that it hurt her throat. The ghost car was real. The story was real. This was the place. This was where her sister's life had ended. The forensic team, clad in white Tyvek suits, took over, turning the pit into a sterile, controlled environment. The car's doors were rusted shut, fused to the frame by years of moisture and pressure. A technician brought out a hydraulic spreader, the jaws of life, and positioned it against the driver's side door. With a high-pitched whine, the tool began to work, and the car's frame groaned in protest, the sound of tortured metal echoing off the quarry walls. Finally, with a loud bang, the door was ripped from its hinges. A wave of foul, musty air, the trapped breath of 9 years, rushed out. The interior was a slurry of mud, rust, and decay. The team's powerful flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the front seats. They were empty. A wild, irrational spark of hope ignited in Charlotte's chest. Maybe Amelia had gotten away. Maybe this was all a mistake. The light moved to the back seat. Also empty. The hope died as quickly as it was born. All eyes turned to the trunk. It was their last and most dreaded destination. The lock was a solid mass of orange rust, completely unworkable. A technician approached with a high-speed cutting tool, and the air filled with the smell of hot metal and a shower of bright orange sparks. The noise was deafening, a brutal assault on the senses. After what felt like an eternity, the final section of metal was severed. 2 technicians, their faces grim behind their masks, used crowbars to pry the trunk lid open. The moment the seal was broken, a smell erupted from the dark space, a wave of such putrid, sickening sweetness that it sent several team members stumbling back, gagging. It was the unmistakable, unforgettable odor of death, concentrated and amplified by 9 years of decay in a sealed metal box. Inside, illuminated by the cold, unforgiving beam of a forensic flashlight, they saw it. A heap of mud-caked blankets, and tangled within them, the fragile, earth-stained shape of human remains. The body was mostly skeletal, but tattered remnants of clothing still clung to the bones. A gloved hand carefully lifted a fragment of fabric. It was silk, and even through the grime the color was visible, a pale, ghostly blue, the exact shade of the bridesmaid dress Amelia had worn on that perfect, sun-drenched day. And there, resting against the delicate vertebrae of the neck, was a broken, tarnished silver chain, the other half of the chain that had once held the heart-shaped locket. A collective, unspoken understanding passed through the team. The search was over. After 348 days of silence, they had finally found Amelia. But the horror was not yet complete. As the forensic team began the slow, painstaking process of documenting and removing Amelia's remains, they realized she was not alone in her metal coffin. Beneath her body was another shape, another large, bundled mass. Kowalski's words echoed in Charlotte's mind. The weights are wrong. The excess tonnage on the shipping manifests. Amelia had been used to cover something else up. As they carefully lifted her, they revealed what she had been hiding. It was a second body. The remains were of a large male, and the cause of death was brutally obvious. A single, small, perfectly round hole was visible in the back of the skull. An execution-style gunshot wound. The unknown driver, the third man David had seen, was not a kidnapper. He was the first victim, his body disposed of with Amelia's in a single, efficient, monstrous act. This scene had reached its apex of horror, but one final, devastating secret remained buried in the mud. Near the second body's skeletal hand, a forensic technician found a small, rectangular object. It was a man's wallet, miraculously preserved in a thick Ziploc bag. With trembling, gloved fingers, the technician opened it and carefully removed the driver's license inside. The plastic was clouded, but the face and name were still legible. Chen held it up to the light. The face was unfamiliar to her, and to Charlotte. But Kowalski, peering over her shoulder, went pale, a look of utter, soul-shattering shock washing over his weary features. His voice was a choked whisper, filled with a dawning horror that was more terrifying than anything that had come before. "Oh my God," he breathed. "That's Daniel. That's Marcus Thorne's younger brother. He supposedly drowned in a boating accident in '98. Marcus hadn't just murdered a witness. He had murdered his own brother and used Amelia's body to hide the evidence. The conspiracy was not about greed. It was about blood. The revelation hung in the cold quarry air, thicker and more suffocating than the smell of decay. Marcus Thorne had murdered his own brother. Kowalski stared at the driver's license, the face of a young man he vaguely remembered from years ago, and the entire narrative of the past decade fractured and reformed into something monstrous. Daniel Thorne's accidental drowning in 1998 wasn't a tragic mishap. It was the original sin, the first murder in a chain of brutal pragmatism. Amelia hadn't just stumbled upon a financial crime. She had unwittingly discovered a fratricide. The weight of this new truth was immense, collapsing the 9-year-old mystery into a single, horrifying point of origin. Marcus wasn't just a killer protecting his business. He was a man who had built an empire on the bones of his own family, and Amelia was just collateral damage in the cover-up. With the stakes now elevated to an unimaginable level, Detective Chen moved with lethal precision. She knew the local justice system, with Garrison at its head, was a compromised minefield. She bypassed them entirely. Armed with the irrefutable evidence from the quarry, the ledger, and Kowalski's resurrected cold case file on Daniel Thorne, she took the entire investigation federal. The combination of multi-state arms trafficking, money laundering, and a dual homicide involving a victim from a decade-old case was more than enough to trigger federal jurisdiction. Within hours, the FBI had taken the lead, effectively building an impenetrable wall around the case, insulating it from the political influence of Thorne and his puppets. The quiet, contained investigation had just exploded onto a national stage, far beyond the reach of a corrupt state attorney general. The arrest of Marcus Thorne was not the dramatic, violent confrontation he might have orchestrated for his enemies. It was a cold, quiet, and humiliating display of overwhelming force. At 6 a.m. the following morning, a convoy of black federal vehicles descended on his palatial estate. Agents swarmed the property with silent efficiency, while another team simultaneously raided his corporate headquarters. Thorne was led from his home in his pajamas, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent fury as the handcuffs clicked shut. The image, broadcast on the morning news, was a death blow to his public persona. The untouchable pillar of the community, the charming philanthropist, was exposed as a common, cuffed criminal. The power he had cultivated for decades evaporated in the harsh light of a new day, his web of influence rendered useless against the brute force of federal law. In a sterile, windowless interrogation room, Thorne's arrogance began to curdle into fear. He sat across from Chen and a steely-eyed FBI agent, initially projecting an air of bored indignation. But then they began. They laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece, on the cold metal table. The tarnished silver locket, the blue leather diary, the photocopied ledger pages. High-resolution photographs of the car being pulled from the earth. Finally, they slid a forensic photo of Daniel's skull, the small, perfectly round hole, a clear testament to his execution. They narrated his crimes back to him, a seamless story from Daniel's murder to the threatening call to the burner phone. Thorne's composure shattered. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated, revealing the hollow, panicked monster beneath. He was trapped not by accusations, but by the undeniable physical proof of his sins. Under the weight of the evidence and the promise of a federal death penalty case, Julian Croft, the ghost from Aegis Tactical, was the first to break. Apprehended at a private airfield trying to board a jet to a non-extradition country, he quickly traded his loyalty for a plea deal. His confession filled in the final, horrifying blanks. He admitted that Marcus had hired him in 1998 to handle his brother Daniel, who was threatening to go to the authorities about the arms deals. Croft was the driver David Miller saw that night. He executed Daniel in the car, then drove to the pre-selected quarry to bury him. It was supposed to be a clean, simple disposal. Croft's testimony was the final nail in the coffin, the insider account that corroborated every piece of evidence Amelia and Charlotte had unearthed. Amelia's death, Croft explained, was a tragic and brutal improvisation. When she confronted Marcus at the wedding, her knowledge of the ledgers made her an immediate and unacceptable liability. Marcus, realizing she had the power to unravel everything, including the truth about Daniel, made the call. He ordered Croft, who was already on standby, to abduct her. The plan was sickeningly simple. Silence her and dispose of her in the same place as Daniel, a location no one would ever think to search twice. The argument David witnessed was Amelia's final, brave stand. The car she got into was not for an escape. It was her executioner's chariot. She wasn't buried to hide one crime, but two, her body used as a horrifying shield to conceal the deeper, darker secret of the first murder. The fallout from the ledger Amelia had died to protect was swift and catastrophic for the network Thorne had built. The federal indictment came down like a guillotine. State Attorney General Robert Garrison and Federal Judge Arthur Bellingham, the two men whose careers had been built on Thorne's blood money, were arrested in a widely publicized sweep. Their fall from grace was absolute, a public spectacle that exposed the rot at the core of the state's justice system. The evidence Amelia had so carefully copied and hidden was the key that unlocked it all, a posthumous act of justice that dismantled a criminal conspiracy from beyond the grave. Her bravery had not been in vain. It had cleansed a system she never knew she was a part of. The trial was a mere formality, a public recounting of facts that were already known and undeniable. Faced with Croft's testimony and the mountain of physical evidence, Marcus Thorne was found guilty on all counts. 2 charges of first-degree murder, racketeering, and a host of conspiracy charges. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in a federal prison. The verdict was delivered to a packed, silent courtroom. For the media, it was the end of a sensational story. For Charlotte, sitting in the back row, it was a quiet, hollow finality. The monster was caged, the legal battle was over. But the victory felt empty, the cost immeasurably high. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring her sister back. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte finally allowed herself to grieve. The frantic energy of the investigation was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. The family held a proper funeral for Amelia, burying her in a quiet cemetery overlooking the Hudson River. Her headstone was simple, bearing her name in a single line. She was brave until the end. Standing before the grave, Charlotte took off her own silver locket, the one she had worn every day for nearly 2 decades, and placed it on the cool granite. It was a final act of letting go, of reuniting the 2 halves of the set. She no longer needed the cold, constant reminder of her loss. She could finally remember Amelia, not as a mystery or a victim, but as the vibrant, fierce, beloved sister she had been. The path forward for Charlotte and David was fragile and uncertain. The revelation of David's 9-year silence had fractured the foundation of their marriage, leaving a chasm of hurt and mistrust. The truth was out, but the damage was done. They began the arduous process of rebuilding, starting with couples therapy. They talked for hours, excavating the painful secrets and fears that had festered between them for so long. It was a painful, raw, and often difficult journey, but it was an honest one. Their old life, built on a bedrock of unspoken trauma, was gone forever. Whether they could build a new one together remained an unanswered question. But for the first time since the wedding, they were facing the future without any ghosts hiding in the shadows. For Frank Kowalski, the case's resolution brought a complicated peace. He had been right all along. His instincts about Thorne, the gnawing feeling that the original investigation had been compromised, were validated. Yet the victory was bittersweet, tainted by the heavy weight of his own failure. He had missed Daniel Thorne's murder, and he would forever be haunted by the thought that if he had dug deeper back then, Amelia might still be alive. He attended her funeral, standing at a respectful distance, a silent guardian watching over the family he had finally, albeit belatedly, helped. With the case officially closed, he returned to his cabin in the Catskills, the ghosts of his career finally laid to rest, leaving him with a quiet, somber sense of closure. The case left an indelible scar on the Hudson Valley. The story of the benevolent billionaire who was secretly a monster became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide in plain sight. The Hayes family estate, the site of so much joy and so much horror, was finally sold to a developer who planned to tear it down. The sprawling oak tree, the silent witness, was felled. The land was being scrubbed clean of its history. For Charlotte, David, and Noah, there was no going back. They needed a new beginning, a place where their last name wasn't synonymous with tragedy. They packed their lives into boxes and moved to the West Coast, seeking anonymity and the chance to build a future on untainted ground. The resolution was not a happy ending, but a real one. It was the story of survival, of the devastating cost of truth, and the quiet, enduring strength of a sister's love. The questions that had haunted Charlotte for 9 years were finally answered. The monster was caged, the conspirators were exposed, and Amelia's name was cleared. The violence was over, but the echoes remained. The story ended not with a triumphant roar, but with a quiet, somber peace, the silence that comes after a violent storm has passed, leaving a landscape that is forever changed, but finally, irrevocably, at rest. The heart locket, its purpose fulfilled, now lay with its owner, its secrets finally given to the world. The Pacific Ocean was a vast, unforgiving blue, a horizon so wide it seemed to swallow the sun whole each evening. From their new home in California, the Hudson Valley felt like a distant, half-forgotten dream, a place of dense woods and darker secrets. Charlotte watched as Noah, now 9, ran along the beach, his laughter carried away by the wind, a sound of pure, untainted joy. They had moved 3,000 miles to escape the ghosts of the past, trading the suffocating embrace of the old estate for the endless expanse of the coast. But she knew that geography was no cure for memory. The scar on their family was not on a map. It was etched into their souls, a permanent reminder that you can run from a place, but you can never outrun the story that happened there. The sun was warmer here, but the shadows it cast were just as long. She had the truth, a commodity she had once believed would be a balm for her grief. She had imagined that knowing what happened to Amelia would bring closure, a final, peaceful chapter. But the reality was far more complex. The truth was not a gentle light. It was a raging fire that had burned down everything she thought she knew, leaving behind a landscape of ash and hard-won clarity. The vague, formless pain of not knowing had been replaced by the sharp, specific agony of the facts. She knew who the monster was, she knew how her sister died, and she knew the price of that knowledge. There was no peace in it, only a grim, heavy certainty. The mystery had been a burden, but the truth was a weight that she would have to carry for the rest of her life, a story written in blood and betrayal. The silver heart locket, the object that started it all, was now gone, resting on a cold granite headstone 3,000 miles away. Its journey mirrored her own. It began as a simple token of sisterly love, a symbol of an unbreakable bond. It then became a trigger, a key that unlocked a 9-year-old tomb of secrets. In the hands of the investigation, it transformed into a piece of evidence, a cold, hard fact in a brutal case. And now, it had returned to its original purpose, a memorial to the girl who had worn it. Charlotte no longer needed to touch its cool metal to feel close to Amelia. The locket's story, its weight and its purpose, was now a part of her. It was no longer an object she carried, but a truth she had finally learned to live with. The entire tragedy was a testament to the corrosive power of secrets. It was a secret that led Marcus Thorne to murder his own brother, and another that led him to murder Amelia. It was David's secret, his fear-driven silence about the black car, that allowed the lie to fester for 9 long years, fracturing their marriage from the inside out. Even the Hayes family's unspoken code of appearances, their need to project a flawless image, had created a space where darkness could thrive unnoticed. The story served as a brutal lesson. Secrets are not anchors that keep you safe. They are chains that drag you down into the depths. They poison everything they touch, and their eventual discovery rarely brings healing, only a violent, painful cauterization of the wound they created. One day, she would have to tell Noah the whole story. She would have to explain that the treasure he found beneath the old oak tree was not the start of a pirate adventure, but the key to uncovering a real-life monster. She would have to look into his innocent eyes and introduce him to the profound adult darkness that had shaped his family's past. How do you explain such calculated evil to a child? How do you preserve his sense of safety in a world where you've proven that monsters are real, and sometimes wear the faces of friends? This looming conversation was a constant, low-level dread in the back of her mind. The trauma of 1999 had not ended with the verdict. Its echoes would continue to ripple forward, shaping another generation in ways she could not yet predict. In the end, Amelia had saved herself, not her life, but her truth. She was no longer just the beautiful, tragic victim who vanished from a party. The narrative had shifted. Through the diary, the key, and the hidden evidence, Amelia had become the author of her own justice. She was a fighter. In her final, terrifying days, she had not simply succumbed to fear. She had laid a meticulous trail of breadcrumbs, a brilliant, desperate gambit designed for one person to find. She was the investigation's first and most important detective. Her legacy was not one of absence, but of incredible, posthumous power. She was the girl who, even from the grave, had the courage to point a finger at the men who wronged her and tear their entire corrupt world down. The ripples of Amelia's bravery extended far beyond her own family. Her story forced a reckoning in a community that had been complicit in its silence. The fall of a state attorney general and a federal judge served as a stark reminder that power is not a permanent shield, and that no one is truly untouchable. It highlighted the quiet heroism of people like Frank Kowalski, the haunted cop who never let go of his one great failure, and Sarah Chen, the relentless investigator who risked her career for a truth she believed in. Their actions proved that while systems can be corrupted, the integrity of a few determined individuals can be enough to expose the rot and restore a semblance of justice, proving that the fight against darkness is often won not by armies, but by the quiet, stubborn refusal to look away. Standing on the edge of the continent, with the setting sun painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, Charlotte finally felt a flicker of something akin to peace. She had not gotten her sister back, and the happy, carefree woman she was on her wedding day was gone forever, another casualty of Thorne's crimes. But she had reclaimed something just as vital, her own narrative. She was no longer a passive character in a tragedy, defined by her loss. She was the woman who had followed a ghost's whisper across a decade, faced down a monster, and dragged a horrifying truth into the light. She was the one who gave her sister a voice when she had none. The grief was still there, a quiet companion, but it no longer defined her. She had survived. The story of Amelia Hayes serves as a chilling reminder that the past is never truly dead, or even past. It lies in wait, buried in the damp earth, locked away in silent vaults, or hidden in the suppressed memories of those who were there. It waits for a chance discovery, a child's curiosity, a single loose thread that, when pulled, can unravel everything. And while the truth may not always bring peace, its pursuit is a testament to the fierce, enduring power of love, a force that can cross the veil of death and demand a final, undeniable reckoning. And what happened here was just the beginning of a much larger story about the secrets powerful people keep. If you want to know what other skeletons are hiding in the closets of the elite, make sure you're subscribed for our next investigation. Because some secrets don't just want to be found, they demand to be heard.